Welcome to our webinar, Developing a Disciple-Making Culture. I'm Marshall Shannon. You may have asked the same question that's been asked by people through the years. Why are some people successful and others are not? And to move it into our work as spiritual leaders, as ministry leaders, why do some succeed at making disciples and others don't? Just a couple of years ago, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book. He's a researcher named Outliers. And the central question to the book is, why are some people successful? And he examines many of the factors that seem to contribute to people being successful. But there was one thing he gets into in particular that is of interest to us. Gladwell seeks to debunk the myth that some people are born geniuses, and because of this can't help but become successful. He shows with wonderful stories and details how this is played out in history. His equation for extraordinary people goes something like this. Someone with a certain threshold of competency, meaning you don't have to be a genius. You just have to have a certain level of intellect or competency or capability and ability. Then you have to have the right set of circumstances. Then you have to have commitment. So it goes like this. Two men are born, cross street from each other, similar circumstances with the same amount of intellect, capabilities, creativity, gifts. They have the same shape. Then they're in the same circumstances, given somewhat the same opportunities. And then you find that one succeeds and other does not. And the difference is, while they have a level of competency in a certain circumstance that affords them opportunities, if they don't have the right amount of commitment, they don't make it. Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote the book Outliers, said that there was a consistent element in people's success, along with their competency and circumstances, was a commitment. And the level of commitment was 1,000 hours of practice. It is said that Mozart had a musically gifted father, that's the right circumstances, and was himself a musical prodigy. That was a threshold of competency. He had a certain level of ability. Mozart wrote his first symphony at 12 years of age, but it wasn't until he was 22, some 10 years later, when he had put in 1,000 hours of practice, that he wrote his first symphony considered a masterpiece. When you go to Bill Gates, certain level of competency, intellect, circumstances that allowed him access to supercomputers out west in California. And he spent 10,000 hours or more, and from that he got a great amount of results, as you can see. So if there's anything any of us should become great at, it should be that we want to become great at making disciples who make disciples. If there's anything any of us should become great at, it's making disciples who can make disciples. Now, as a pastor, you might be working toward, and your focus is not on making disciples who can make disciples. And so you're busy building a building, cleaning a building, decorating a building, building a sermon or a series of sermons, or you're working on polishing and getting something ready with a process or a program you've got. And while all these things are necessary and a part of the equation, I want to focus your attention in this series on the disciple-making series, that you would give attention to making disciples and what that requires. We've already talked about the course of making disciples. And in this webinar, we're talking about the culture that we develop as leaders to make disciples. There are 3 essentials to building a disciple-making culture. Do you know what they are? Well, here's what we believe they are. First, you've got to have a course, a vehicle, a process, a pathway for making disciples. Secondly, you've got to have commitment. Commitment by the person who is doing the discipling and commitment by those who are wanting to become disciples. And thirdly is communication. There has to be a vocabulary and a language that is adopted and used in order to make disciples. So we're going to break down these 3 points and talk about them as we go through this webinar. First, there has to be initiative. There has to be initiative. The leader, and if you has to go do the inviting, but he has to take the initiative in that. Simply put, we invite only a few people. While Christ was able to manage and to balance his time and share his life with many people, we're looking at this and thinking, well, we need to initiate relationships in order to invite people to become disciples of Christ. And Christ was able to handle a whole bunch of people, 12, and then he had along with that the 72, and then 120, and then there were the crowds. And so not everyone could press up against him and be the inner circle. But he was able to handle more than we might be able to handle. So he had the intimate 3 that he discipled, Peter, James, and John, beyond the 12 disciples. He had the 72, then the 120, and then there were the crowds. But for us, in order to develop the course, a disciple-making course, a vehicle, a pathway, a process, something we're going to use to transport us as we're making disciples, you need to, as the disciple maker, the one who is the leader, initiate the relationship and at some point invite them into a smaller group. We're not going to have probably as few as 3, but we're certainly not going to have as many as 12. Now you can. It's your program and your process as you decide to. So you might decide on 5 or 6 or 7 people. You've got to find your equilibrium. I have done it with one-on-one disciple making and one on 5 or 6. And you've got to find what works for you. And so in this course, we've got to develop an initial group. Christ had his initial group, and we've got to do the same thing. So Jesus invited 12 people. We're going to assume right off the bat we can't do as many as he did. And so we're going to invite people into our group, into our initial group. And this group of 4 to maybe 7 people, you might do 10. You're going to believe that these are the people that God has called you, that you're going to do the following things. And you're going to make a commitment to them. And you are going to invest your life in them. These are the people who you believe God has called you to invest your life in. And you're going to be intentional about discipling them. It means that you're going to have some organization, meaning you may meet with them once a week or once every other week. And you are going to have a plan where you're going to do what we talked about in the early one. You're going to give them information, then offer them an internship and immerse them in the process and in your culture of disciple making so that they can in turn step into making a disciple themselves. Then they're the ones who are the leaders who initiate and invite, and now they're going to invest themselves intentionally in an organized way to make disciples. But also it's organic. It's organic in that you want to make certain that while you're intentional, you also let it spring up as God plans so that it has an organic, informal component to it. So it's formal and informal. It's intentional, but you're going to allow God to do some things organically. So you're not going to make it so strict, so regimented, so structured that people feel like they are trapped. You want to let it be organic so that people can use their gifts, their spiritual gifts, their passions, their abilities, their personality type, and their experience to blend and shape, because it's not just the leader who's going to shape the culture. The people who are involved, the disciplees, are also going to shape the culture. And we'll get to that in a moment. You've got to allow them to be immersed in the process. immersed in the process so that you can help them and give them time to move and develop and shape and get accustomed to what is happening. All right, so immersion happens as you intentionally invest yourself in them. And then they have to imitate you. They've got to imitate you. And in doing so, you've got to be worthy of imitation. So the investment of your life, when you look at the life of Christ, he took them along all through the day. It was 24/7, was it not? 365. Some believe that he put this amount of his 3-year period, that up to half of it to 18 months was intentionally focused in on those 12, not the bigger groups. So he had a life that he could be imitated. People could pray as he prayed, talk as he talked, think as he thought, reason as he reasoned, and walk and work and worship as he did. It was safe to do so. If you're going to be a disciple maker, your life needs to be worthy so that they can worship as you do, walk as you do, work as you do, interact with others. And Christ took them, his disciples, through so that they could see him living out. It was organized particular times where he taught them, and organic, meaning that he did it cooking breakfast together. They were camping out together. They were fishing together. They were traveling together. They were there when he was healing the sick, rebuking the Pharisees, dealing with the lame and the sinful, when he was going to eat at the table with sinners. They were there experiencing and immersed in everything they saw about his life. They could imitate. They wanted to be and could be Christ-like. So there is the disciple-making communication that needs to happen. And that is a shared language that shapes the culture. You have a verbal and a vocabulary that you are using, a verbal vocabulary, and then you have nonverbal. So you have images and symbols and body language that is being used. So as you develop the culture, you are going to have this happen, and you're going to use the communication, the language, to shape your culture. So a course, and then along with the course, you're going to have this communication that goes with it, and you're going to develop a community. A community develops as you do this, and you have behavior and things that are acceptable and things that are unacceptable. In truth, that is conveyed. And so you're going to use the symbols, the language, and the images, and you're going to find a way to create a community that develops, that truth is conveyed, doctrine, that spiritual truth, that scriptures and the concepts, precepts, principles about Christ, not just about his life and knowing the facts, but knowing him, a working knowledge of a relationship with him. You're going to use the disciple-making communication to let them know what you're doing and how you're teaching. So there's got to be a course that you develop, a process. There has to be a commitment on each person that is involved to invest their life and be worthy of imitating, because now the disciples are going to become disciple makers. But you can use a language, because language does shape culture. So you're going to create your own language. I'll give you an example. I was coaching for years our sons as they grew up. Then I coached high school baseball. And I loved the sport, enjoyed the sport. My dad reared me, coached me, taught me. And so my wife got tickled one season, when I'm coaching these little guys. They're started at T-ball, 4 years old, 5 years old, all the way up into high school. In the league we had, there wasn't much culture developed where the kids were exposed to the game of baseball. And so I taught them and developed. Every year I was given a different team. Usually one or both of my sons were on my team, and I developed a baseball culture what was acceptable and unacceptable. We had nonverbal and verbal language communication that we used, and we had a vocabulary and sign language. We had signals, and we used all of this for them to know, and I had certain little sayings that I developed, things like, how does a player play? And build a wall and stop the ball. All that was about fielding. And then I had a language that communicated what was expected of them, and the way that we played ball, it was Shannon ball, that the way they ran the bases, the way they postured themselves when they pitched and threw the ball, the way that they fielded, the way that they hit at the plate, swung at the ball. And I had this one saying that I grew up with, didn't think a thing about it, but I would be coaching, and our guys would go out to the field, and I would tell them, all right, guys, 3 up, 3 down. Well, you're listening to me. Do you know what I mean? Well, I use that language. All right, guys, encouraged them. I'd clap my hands and say, all right, 3 up, 3 down. Let's go. Let's get them out. At the end of the season, one of the ball players, a little guy, maybe he was 10, walked up to me and looked at me and kind of grabbed his head and looked at me and said, Mr. Shannon, I got what you mean by that. 3 up, 3 downs mean 3 batters come to the plate and all of them get out. They don't get on base. 3 up to the plate, 3 back to the dugout. I said, you got it. That's what I mean. My wife is laughing because what I thought everyone understood, including the dads, who I incorporated a system where I taught the dads, and the dads went and taught their sons and the other players, and we built a baseball culture every year with those dads. And so I put some of what I'm teaching you into play in being a coach with the sport of baseball. But every church has its culture, whether you identify it or not, whether you want to agree with it or not. You have a church culture, and you have a church communication, a language. I was told the story once of a little boy who was sitting with his dad for the first time in the service, and he was old enough to sit there, I guess, after children's church, or they were visiting somewhere. And as the service started, the little boy would lean over to his daddy or crawled up in his lap and said, Dad, what does that mean? And he was explaining the songs and the music and the offering and the announcements, and then the preacher got up to preach, took his watch off and laid it on the pulpit, and the dad had explained that the little boy looked and said, what does it mean? Why did he lay his watch on the pulpit? What does that mean? And his dad looked down at his son and said, absolutely nothing. Well, every church has a culture, and it has a pathway, a process. It has commitment that has to be given, and it has a culture of communication, a shared language that is shaping the culture of that church, and it's verbal and nonverbal. And we use images and symbols and body language, and we use certain words and the way that we phrase it in hand signals, and we have signals and symbols and images. And a community develops around those things. Remember this, and I say, while you're conveying truth and wanting to make disciples that make disciples, people who come into you, you've got to give time for them to absorb the information, for them to have some type of internship where they're gathering it in, and then you've also got to have it where they can absorb the information and where they have opportunity to learn what they're being taught, and then they're going to innovate. They're going to innovate and take and apply to their own life, and they're going to do what I call marshalize it. Well, if your name is Henry, you Henryize it. Or Sam, you Samize it. Or Pam, you Pamize it. Or Sally, you Sallyize it. You make it your own, and you shape and mold it to yourself. So in your disciple-making culture, you are not the only one who is shaping the culture. You have to give them freedom to marshalize it, to disciple-ize it, to fit them. Then they will go and they will initiate and invite and invest their life into another person And as they have initiated this relationship, invited them into a relationship with Christ so that they might become a fully devoted and developed follower of Christ, that they are going to customize it to their life. And guess what? The person discipled by your person that you disciple will customize it to themselves. They will innovate it so that the information they have received and the instruction they have received and the opportunity to grow and develop during that internship, that they are immersed in the culture of it, gives them time to personalize and take ownership of it, and they are going to flesh out their relationship with Christ and their disciple-making process in their own way. And I think you need to give them freedom to do that so that God is honored. So in a disciple-making components, you're going to give them information, and they're going to imitate you, and then they're going to innovate what they see lived out in your life, because they're a completely different person in their shape, spiritual gifts, their heart, their abilities, their personality, and their experience. They are a different person. Allow them to innovate, and so this grows and develops. I'm not telling you to let them teach the doctrine differently than what you understand, and you have to maintain a certain amount of control to stay true to Scripture, and so that you're making disciples that you know are honoring Christ. And you've got to cultivate and carve out and care for and protect the process and the disciple-making culture and course that you have and the communication that is there. But as you're doing this, make certain that you allow for some innovation so that they can make it their own, and they're going to go and see what God does with it. Now, along with this, in a disciple-making culture, the way that cultures are made, let's just talk about some components here of this, all right? The first one, and this is an acrostic that I put together, and if you want to get more than this, my acrostic's not quite the same, but Samuel R. Chand wrote a book on cracking your church's culture code, 7 Keys to Unleashing Vision and Inspiration. In this case, I'm applying it to your disciple-making culture. That he says in the book that there has to be a certain amount of control. There's accountability and support, but it is mutual. Everyone contributes. So often we've done our ministries top down, and so when we've done things, we've kind of decided, well, here's what programs we're going to develop, and we've tried to force a person into the program, and it may not fit like a square peg in a round hole. Instead of doing that, it's going to be a community that is mutually working together to provide accountability up and down the leadership and fellowship spectrum that you've got in your organization. So that for your culture to be developed, one of the key components to that, to unleashing your disciple-making culture, is that of control. You need to be in control, but you need to release control, and it's back to the innovation business where you're allowing them freedom to develop and shape it according to their own, who they are and the way they best suit it, so you're not forcing them. For instance, back to the baseball analogy. When you throw a baseball, you can throw straight overhand, 3/4, sidearm, or underhand. Now in submarine. And so in doing that, different players and the way they're put together would be best suited for throwing a certain way. Now, baseball guys will break out in hives by saying that. But when you look at the way a person is organically put together, they have a shape. At the baseball plate, when a guy is batting, I had to work with different shapes of players. Not everybody's a power hitter, and not everybody's a spray hitter, and some are both. And so as you categorize them, you want to give some control to them for them to customize it and allow them freedom to be the kind of disciple maker that God has shaped and made them, both in nature and nurturing. Now, so they're not forced where everybody has to throw overhand or everybody has to be a power hitter. They can take a different stance and approach the plate and the ball and the game in different ways. The same thing with disciple making. Then there's understanding. There has to be comprehension. Where we talk about control, comprehension. They have to understand what you're trying to accomplish. They have to have some understanding of the vision that God has for what he wants to do in shaping and molding, maturing, and making your church, your congregation. What God's vision is for your disciple-making efforts, your culture. So people have to understand it. If they can't understand it, how are they supposed to contribute? And the answer is they're going to have problems contributing to your disciple-making efforts if they don't understand what you're trying to accomplish. They have to understand the mission, they have to visualize and see the vision, and they have to take ownership of it. Then there's leadership, where you've got to have leaders. The disciple maker is got to disciple and lead and care for and support and give accountability to the disciplees. That makes up part of the culture. The disciple-making culture is made up of trust. It is mutual trust between the disciple maker and the disciplee. So the discipler and the disciplee have to have trust. If that breaks down, the process and the culture will break down. You'd better protect the trust factor in your culture of disciple making. Then there has to be, and this is Chan, the way that he puts it, unafraid. There has to be two things here, and grab a hold of these. There has to be a conviction where they are convicted that this is God's calling and cause for them to be involved in the making disciples. They have to take personal ownership and buy into the Great Commission to make disciples. There has to be conviction for the cause. Secondly, there has to be a commitment to Christ. It has to be personal in a relationship to them. They can't just ride on your back and on your commitment and on your relationship with Christ. They have to be unafraid because they are driven by their personal conviction to the cause of Christ, and they are committed to Christ personally. And so it is something they've taken ownership of Christ and of their relationship to them. They are unafraid to move ahead in this, regardless of what it costs them, because they have conviction and commitment. They are consecrated to Christ. Then here's the R in the acrostic, and that is responsive. There has to be collaboration and communication as a team to do several things: to safeguard each other, to safeguard the process, and to reach the aim or the goal or the vision that God has given you. So there has to be responsiveness to safeguard, to protect, to support, accountability, and everybody has to be working together so that you're protecting. The scriptures talk about in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. Well, you want to have everyone on the team watching out, everyone working together. A good example of this, and I coached basketball and soccer. Well, sometimes we worked with hand signals, body movements, even with our eyes to communicate with each other, but we also looked and worked together. I taught a system of defense and a way to play basketball in high school that I learned while I was a coach of help and recover. So that if on defense, let's say that we're playing man-to-man, that's how I taught help and recover, that an opponent beat the man who was covering him one-on-one, and another player was taught to come and collapse in and block out that guy to shut him down without committing a foul, and to play good defense with their feet and then their legs and the upper body. But it was initiated and run by quickness with the feet to position yourself on the floor, so if he kept coming at you, he would get a charging foul until the player who was beat can come back and recover, help and recover. Everyone on the team had to watch out for everyone else and to look for what the enemy was doing. Responsiveness spiritually with the processes, so that you were safeguarding, and you were safeguarding the cause, and you were safeguarding Christ, and you were safeguarding your community, your team, the group that you had put together. And so it's teamwork in a wonderful way where you are helping each other. It is a marvelous experience. And the last one in the acrostic is execution. implementation, where you implement the plan. You make disciples that makes disciples. You can't just have a great process and a plan and a procedure that is set up with all the components to make your strategic plan of disciple making happen. And you've got it all together, but you don't implement it. People are going to have to implement the information you give them. They're going to have to carry it out and imitate what you're showing them to do, and then innovate it. There has to be, as we talked in the earlier webinar on the disciple making course, that there has to be information given, instruction, internship, where they're imitating and watching you do it, and then immersion in it long enough in the culture of disciple making that they are executing it and carrying it out. I was petrified in college when I went to a course on leading music, because I don't have any real music ability. I had leadership ability, and after they were giving us the information, they made a couple of guys stand up with 500 of us sitting in this classroom, this chapel, and had us lead a song with all of us singing. Well, I didn't know how to keep rhythm. I had never been taught this. It was the first time I was exposed to it. And fortunately, the teacher, the instructor, knew to pick somebody who had already had some internship and stood up and led it. Well, in my internship and going to work with pastors, they would stick me up there to lead the music. And I had to learn to lead with my personality and enthusiasm and to lead them spiritually with it, because I didn't know, and I ended up having to do that as an intern in a church and then as a senior pastor at the very front end. Well, I had to execute what I was imitating and had seen and what I had practiced, and it got thrown into it. You got to execute the plan. You've got to put it into action. And so in disciple making, you can't leave it to the classroom. You've got to get them in and get them committed and practicing what you're doing and immersed in it long enough to where they become experts at it, so that you can make disciples that make disciples. Well, I'm Marshall Shannon, your ministry design coach with ministry design training and concepts. You can reach me at this email address or either one of these two phone numbers, and we'll be happy to give you one-on-one coaching to help you develop your disciple-making culture.